Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today, in cell injury, we will discuss the causes of cell injury. This is a continuation of our series of online classes. In the previous lecture, we discussed uh, an overview and an overview of the cell injury and cellular adaptations, and we discussed various adaptations. Uh, for example, hypertrophy, atrophy, metaplasia, and things like that. For a normal cell to remain healthy and functional physiologically and anatomically, it must have a continuous supply of nutrients, oxygen, glucose, and amino acids. Internally, everything should be normal, starting from the nucleus to the cytoplasm, ribosomes, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum. And there should be constant removal of the waste products, particularly the products of metabolism and carbon dioxide, and the immediate environment for a cell, it will be appropriate. By what we mean that while in homeostasis and in a normal intermediate environment, the cell will function normally. If either there is some intrinsic abnormality in the cell or if there is a change towards the a change in the immediate environment that does not facilitate a cell survival, so in these cases cellular adaptations and cell injury will occur. We know that when the cells are severely stressed, mostly in the initial phase when the cells are stressed, the cells that undergo adaptation and adjust itself according to the new steady state. But it depends on the capability of the cells, adaptive capability of the cells. So if the stress is very severe or if the cells are unable to adapt, this will lead to cell injury. In addition, if the cell is having some intrinsic abnormality, for example, accumulation of misfolded proteins or some genetic abnormality that is internal to the cell, it will also cause cell injury. And sometimes an inherently damaging agent. For example, if an invading organism or acute inflammation that is caused by various physical, chemical, and microbiological causes, if it cannot be resolved because of the resistance of the invading agent, for example, mycobacterium tuberculosis, certain viruses, and for example, accumulation of such things like carbon and silica particles, coal dust, where the cell is lacking a machinery to metabolize these uh, uh, things. So what will happen? The cell injury will occur. Initially, the cell will pass through a reversible stage. By that what we mean that if the agent, the causative agent or the etiological factor is removed, the cell potentially can reverse to its normal state. But In conditions that I describe in the form of severe stress, inability of the cell to adapt, if there is some existing intrinsic abnormality of if the invading agent is inherently damaging, resistant, or if there is some problem in the immune system, what happens that after passing through the reversible injury, cell death will occur. And the reversible cell injury describes the sequence of events that occur when the cell passes from its normal status through reversible stage into the cell death. Now, there are two pathways for the cell death to occur, and we said cell death is of two types. One is the necrotic cell death, which we can say that it is an induced form of cell death, and its causes are always pathological. And necrotic cell death occurs commonly as the result of irreversible cell injury. When the cell is so much injured that it cannot reverse to its normal state, the cell will die by necrotic cell death. The other type of cell death, which is known as the apoptic cell death or programmed cell death, this is different from the necrotic cell death, that necrotic cell death is always pathological, while there are certain circumstances in which apoptic cell death may be physiological. It is needed. For example, during embryogenesis, certain cells which are not needed, they are referred to the apoptic cell death. And for this reason, it is known as the programmed cell death. For example, during the immune cell development, the cells that are non-self and those cells that doesn't recognize the body own tissues, and they will initiate or elicit a reaction against the body own tissue in the form of an autoimmune reaction. These cells are made dead by the apoptic cell death. Sometimes necrosis and apoptosis may coexist, and the pathological apoptic cell death occurs particularly in situations when the cells are deprived of its tropic signals. In chemotherapy for the treatment of cancers, most of those treatments, they cause apoptic cell death of the malignant cells. Now we can divide the causes of cell injury into physical agents, for example, extremes of temperature, severe cold, severe heat, and trauma, physical trauma, and radiation that can also physically damage the cells. And in addition to physical agents, there are certain chemical agents in the form of drugs and poisons that cause cell death. And microbial agents, the bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, rickettsia, they can attack the tissues and can cause cell death. Additionally, inappropriately directed immune reactions in the form of autoimmunity, where the immune system elicit reactions against the body's own tissues, can cause cell death. In conditions of hypersensitivity or allergy of the genetically susceptible persons to the allergens and antigens that normally exist in the environment and not everybody will develop allergy or hypersensitivity, but certain individuals who have genetic susceptibility, they will develop hypersensitivity and allergy. For example, in bronchial asthma. So, two types of immune injury in the form of hypersensitivity and autoimmunity, they will cause cell death. The lack of nutritional supply. As in the previous slide, I showed you that the cells to remain survive and remain functional and healthy, it should have a continuous supply of oxygen, glucose, and blood supply and other nutrients required by the cells, tissues, and body. So, if due to any reason there is a lack of the nutritional supply, potentially it will cause cell death. Certain metabolic changes, for example, excess hormones or deficiency, acid-base balance, taking the body either to metabolic or respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, and also to metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, and electrolyte imbalances, for example, in the form of hypernatremia, hyperkalemia, hypercalcemia, hypocalcemia, they can also cause cell death. If there is hepatic failure or some conditions leading to inability of the kidneys to perform its normal functions, as well as if there is lack of growth factors which are important for the cells to function and grow normally. So if the cells are deprived of these growth factors, the cell will suffer from irreversible injury and will pass first through a state of reversible cell injury, then into the irreversible cell injury. Now, in irreversible cell injury, damage is suffered by the parenchymal cells as well as by the interstitial tissue, the tissue in between the cells. So, injury to the interstitial tissue or injury to the interstitium can indirectly cause the cell death, because the cell must have an appropriate favorable environment and that provide facilitation and support to the cells. If this environment is deranged, what will happen? The cell will indirectly die. Now coming to a little detailed discussion of the causes of the cell injury, the cellular hypoxia, lack of oxygen, hypomania, less oxyamania, oxygen, is the very common cause of death. We must differentiate hypoxia from ischemia. Ischemia is ischemia, reduced or insufficient blood supply to a tissue, while hypoxia is lack of oxygen. So, ischemia can be a very common cause of hypoxia, but hypoxia can also occur in the absence of ischemia. In ischemia, there is insufficient blood supply to the tissue or organ. In hypoxia, there is insufficient oxygen supply. So, we can think that there can be conditions in which there is no ischemia but there is hypoxia. For example, in diseases of the lungs in which there is no proper oxygenation of the hemoglobin due to some problem in the gases, alveolar gases exchange, so there will be hypoxia. In this case, though there is no ischemia, but there is hypoxia. The blood and the hemoglobin is not sufficiently oxygenated. Another example of hypoxia without ischemia is the iron deficiency anemia. Here what happens that the oxygen carrying capacity of the hemoglobin is diminished. And since in this case the hemoglobin is unable to carry oxygen as we commonly see in iron deficiency anemias, there is no ischemia but there is hypoxia. Now ischemia will result either from impeded arterial flow, for example due to an atherosclerotic obstruction of an artery, and sometimes there can be a blockage in the venous drainage which will push back the resistance to the flow of blood through capillary into the arterial circulations. And in these situations, the cells are unable to get sufficient oxygen, and this will lead to cell death. Now, we know that the powerhouse of the cell known as the mitochondria, where ATP, which is the currency of the cell and which is required for many cellular functions known as the ATP dependent functions, they require and need ATP, and without ATP these functions and processes cannot be operated more. So if the mitochondria is deprived of oxygen, and we know that in mitochondria there is oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic respiration which provide ATP to the cell for various functions needed for various functions of the cell. So when the cell is deprived of its oxygen, when the mitochondria are deprived of the oxygen, the oxidative phosphorylation becomes defective and there is less supply of the ATP. And when the ATP supply falls deficient, what happens that many functions of the cell, for example sodium potassium ATPase pump, it becomes deranged and defective and will lead to consequences that will terminate at the cell death. Now what happens when the mitochondria are deprived of its blood supply? When there is no oxygen, there will be deficient oxidative phosphorylation and deficient production of the ATP. We know that ATP is needed by the sodium pump that occurs through the cell membrane. So what happens when the sodium potassium ATPase pump is deranged? What will happen that the concentration of sodium which is put in an optimal condition between inside and outside the cell, what will happen that the sodium, it will rush into the inside of the cell. As we know, the sodium will be followed by water. So the influx of sodium and water into the cell caused by the failure of the sodium potassium ATPase pump due to lack of ATP from mitochondria, it will cause cellular swelling, and it is also known as the hydropic degeneration. Unfortunately, in severe conditions, there is influx of calcium into the inside of the cell, and we know that this influx of calcium into the inside of the cell can have very serious consequences. For example, this calcium will activate hydrolytic enzymes in proteases, hydrolysis, and that will cause uh, breakdown of uh, intracellular organelles and will initiate activation of the enzymes that are normally inactivated. There is also an efflux of potassium. The potassium leaves the inside of the cell and goes out. So this situation will lead to the influx of water and sodium into the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum becomes swollen and the cell membrane becomes swollen and there is loss of microvilli and blebs are formed on the cell membrane. So this is the effect of the loss of ATP on the membrane permeability. Moreover, when the cell is unable to get ATP from aerobic respiration, which needs the presence of oxygen, but when the cell is deprived of oxygen for a short period of time, like in emergency, there will be anaerobic glycolysis. And anaerobic glycolysis, do it provides some sort of ATP and energy to the cell, but it is a short-lived process because it will lead to the depletion of glycogen. Glucose is used and glycogens are depleted. Moreover, during this process, since there is no oxygen, there will be production of the lactic acid. What happens that excess production of the lactic acid reduces the pH, make the intracellular environment of the cell acidic. And when the environment inside the cells become acidic, many enzymes that work in an optimum environment, when the acidity inside the cell is increased, these enzymes they become inactivated. Due to swelling of the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosomes, where the proteins, structural and functional proteins are synthesized, and they are attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So due to swelling of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, these ribosomes they are detached, and this will lead to a decrease in protein synthesis. So this was the situation that we discussed due to hypoxia and ischemia. Certain chemical agents they can also cause cell injury. There are many things that we consider innocuous. By innocuous we mean कि ये ज़ाहिरी तौर पे हमें बिल्कुल बेज़रर लगते हैं, such as glucose, salt, or even water can derange the osmotic equilibrium and can cause cell injury. And we know that even water, if a person's become overhydrated or if a person's become dehydrated, both of these conditions can cause damage to the cells. There are certain poisons that cause severe damage at the cellular level, and they either act by altering the membrane permeability, the osmotic homeostasis, by causing derangements in the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, or they may affect the integrity of an enzyme or a cofactor and can cause cell injury. So poisons, drugs and chemicals, they mostly differ from each other based on their mechanism of action, that how do they cause cell injury. Environmental agents, for example air pollutants, and you know that pollution is a problem, major problem in our today life. And insecticides that we use to kill insects, carbon monoxides and alcohol, they also cause cell injury. Moreover, drugs and therapeutic pharmacologic agents, they should be very properly used. Its dose must not be exceeded, and each drug for each disease and each condition has a particular dosage, and this dosage must be very properly followed, because if it is used excessively or inappropriately, it can cause cell death. Better, you have seen many drugs with their side effects and overdosage, which cause cell injury and cell death. Now, coming to the oxygen, which is uh, the very important need of our body and our cells, particularly for oxidative phosphorylation and generation of ATP, even if it is at high partial pressure, it will cause toxicity. And therefore, there are also limits. We cannot increase the partial pressure of oxygen to beyond a certain extent, and then it will cause cellular toxicity and cell death. Now, coming to the infectious agents, they include bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, and since there is a huge number of bacteria, large number of viruses, so they can cause cell damage, particularly in persons who are, we say, immunocompromised with a poor or weakened immune system. And they differ from each other in their virulence. Some bacteria are very virulent and some are less. So we discuss the mechanism of action. Some bacteria, they affect the cell wall, and the viruses, they mostly damages the inside of the cells, because virus will use the cellular DNA or RNA for replication, and there are so many bacterial, viral, fungal and parasitic diseases, and all of them can cause cell injury and cell death. Immunologic reactions, as we said in our previous uh, slide, that in autoimmune conditions, what happens that our immune system, which normally differentiates self from non-self, and there are situations in which the immune system fails to differentiate self and non-self, loss of self-tolerance. And what happens that the immune system elicit immunologic and inflammatory responses against the body own tissues, and this will give rise to autoimmune diseases, and there is a large number of autoimmune diseases, for example, rheumatoid arthritis, rheumatic fever, pernicious anemia, systemic lupus erythematosus, and so many diseases are there where the basic mechanism is that there is no problem from the outside, but our own immune system starts to develop an immune and inflammatory reactions against the body own tissues, and these are known as the autoimmune diseases. And unfortunately, these diseases are very resistant and difficult to be treated. Though we can go certain modifications, but the cure and treatment of these diseases is very difficult. Now, the microorganisms, not all the microorganisms that cause cell damage. Some microorganisms and bacteria, they are very friendly and they are very beneficial to our body. For example, the intestinal flora and commensals, जिसको हम commensals कहते हैं, they lie there and they compete with pathogenic microorganisms. This is the pathogenic microorganisms which will cause problem and which will cause disease. And there are certain situations, for example, I will give you an example that if mostly we see that a child who have some sort of respiratory tract infection or other infection, we give him antibiotics, and this antibiotics not only kill the pathogenic bacteria but also the commensals, the friendly bacteria inside the intestine. And on the second day the mother comes with her child that the child has also developed diarrhea. So we will discuss these conditions in more detail on its own term. Genetic factors is the cause of cell injury. बेटा हमारी genetic makeup जो है ना, that is very properly arranged and organized, and problems in the genetic makeup can cause pathologic changes. For example, we have 46 chromosomes which are arranged in 23 pairs of one pair of sex chromosomes XY and 22 pairs of the autosomes. But in Down syndrome, the genetic problem is that there is an extra chromosome on chromosome 21. Instead of 2, there are 3 chromosomes. This is also known as 21 trisomy, and this situation leads to severe mental retardation and very miserable life, not only to the patient but also to his or her parents. There are certain diseases which are very minor or subtle and not like Down syndrome or Klinefelter syndrome or other serious diseases. So for example, in sickle cell anemia, what happens that a single amino acid known as glutamic acid, it is replaced by another amino acid valine in the beta chain of the hemoglobin, and the result of this one amino acid change, which is changed by the substitution of one we say that we have 4 nucleotides in our genetic makeup, adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine, and which converts into thiouracil in RNA. So one nucleotide is replaced by another, and the result is that the glutamic acid is, instead of glutamic acid, the DNA and RNA makes valine. The structure of the beta chain of the hemoglobin is changed, and it will give rise to sickle cell anemia, in which sickle shaped cells, red blood cells, are formed, and they are unable to perform their function in a very effective and efficient manner. Genetic defects may also cause cell injury as the result of deficiency of functional proteins, and like such as enzymes that occur in inborn errors of metabolism, and sometimes there is accumulation of damaged DNA or accumulation of improperly folded proteins in the endoplasmic reticulum, and both these conditions, when they are excessive and uncontrolled by the cell repairing mechanisms, they will cause cell death. But the genetic variations, polymorphism, you consider this as morphism, morphological polymany. Here we will discuss polymorphism and SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphism, and copy number variation in details when we will study genetic disorders. But here I will tell you that nobody is perfect. Each person, each and every person carry a number of mutations in his genetic makeup. And these mutations play two roles. They are the identification of that person, like identity card, and these SNPs or polymorphisms make certain persons very susceptible to some diseases. So this doesn't mean that each polymorphism will make person diseased, but they have the property of making some persons very susceptible to various types of complex diseases. And they also modify the susceptibility of the cells to injury by chemicals and other environmental insults. So these genetic variations, polymorphisms, SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and copy number variations, we will discuss them in detail in when we discuss genetic disorders. Nutritional deficiencies, protein calorie insufficiencies, vitamins and mineral deficiencies, they can potentially cause cell death. And this is not only the deficiency, excessive intake can also cause health problems and diseases. For example, if the caloric intake is much greater than the calorie output, what will happen? That particularly in the sedentary life and in conditions where we lack exercise, it will lead to obesity. And you know, obesity is a risk factor for many diseases. For example, type 2 diabetes mellitus, hypertension, heart diseases, diseases like arthritis. And there are so many diseases. Here there is no deficiency, but there is excessive accumulation of fat that is caused by intake of excessive calories. When the calories are excess, what will happen? In the liver, they will be converted into fats and stored in the body, and they will cause then problems. Now, diet rich in animal fat. We all know that there is strong association in the development of the excess animal fat, particularly in the case of atherosclerosis, which can lead to myocardial infarctions and which can lead to certain types of cancers. And in today life, that is the main target of medicines and various modifying factors that are advised mostly to the patient. For example, dieting, exercise, and lipid lowering drugs, because excess diet, excess animal fat in the diet will lead to the accumulation of fat, and when fats are accumulated in the wall of the blood vessels, this will cause arteriosclerosis, arteriosclerosis, and particularly the arteriosclerosis in the medium-sized blood vessels will cause obstruction, and they will facilitate clot formation, and usually we get patients of myocardial infarction. Aging itself is a it can be a cause or it can facilitate cell death. Cell they have a counted number of cell divisions, and after they complete a certain number of cell divisions they come to stop, and this is known as the cellular senescence. And similarly, along with the cellular senescence, the DNA repairing ability of the cells it is also decreased with life. And as we know that in this world we have a definite count of uh, days, hours, and minutes to live. The same is about the cells. They cannot remain alive and remain healthy indefinitely. And sometimes, here in this uh, situation, I will tell you two important things that the telomeres and telomerase enzyme, which provides protection to the chromosomes during cell division, it becomes shortened and shortened after the repeated cell divisions. And ultimately, a time comes that it is so much shortened that it can no longer provide protection to the chromosomes, and here the cell ability to divide and proliferate is seriously affected. Unfortunately, the cancer cells they have evergreen telomeres which make them live for longer times, and there are other cells in the body known as the stem cells which are concerned with the providing new populations of cells. They also have their telomeres more stronger than the normal cells, and the sperm and ovaries they have evergreen telomeres and telomerase, and they remain always healthy, and they can perform their functions without uh, any decrease in their telomeres and lack of telomerase enzymes. And this is, if you think better, it is important for the continuation of life. So, all of these changes result in a diminished ability of the cell to respond to damage and eventually the death of the cell and death of the organs and tissues. Thank you very much.